laugh. It's a laugh.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. How do we judge the health of our economic systems? Well, it's about far more than those headline numbers on joblessness and growth. My guest today is the Nobel Prize-winning economist, Sir Angus Deaton. He has focused on what he calls the deaths of despair attributed to suicide and drug and alcohol abuse, indicators, he says, of a sickness in the American economic model. And now, of course, we have the coronavirus pandemic as well. So, has a fundamental weakness been exposed in capitalism? Sir Angus Deaton in Princeton, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back.
Let me ask you a simple question. You are one of the world's renowned economists, and in your latest work, you have focused very much on death and mortality rates. Why have you done that?
I've always believed that, life is about much more than just money. And I'm interested throughout my career in well-being, in what makes people tick and what matters. And, having money is not worth a whole lot if you don't have a life to enjoy it with. So mortality is, a key component of trying to assess a much more complete picture of what it is that's happening to people.
You talk of a complete picture. The big picture, according to several sort of political scientists, stroke economists, the big picture, if one looks not just across the developed but the developing world as well, is a mortality story which is profoundly optimistic, that the longevity of the human race is rising and that we've frankly never had it so good. And yet your work, which is very specific, seems to suggest, in America in particular, that's not right.
Well, you and I are obviously talking about pre-COVID, so maybe we'll come back to that. And that was why what Ann Case and I found when we started this work in 2013 or so, when we discovered that death rates were going up for midlife people and middle-aged white Americans. That we were just astonished. I mean, we were doing something else. We were pulling down these data. We looked at these numbers and we just couldn't believe what we were seeing. And it couldn't possibly be true because of what you just said, that we had a century of mortality decline. And what in goodness name was happening? And, our first thought was it can't possibly be true. Because it was happening, people would be shouting this from the rooftops. But, it was true. And it was a major reversal from what we've seen for 100 years of progress.
As you say, we need to address what is happening with COVID-19 as well. But before we get to COVID-19, just explain to me, as you dug into the data about mortality rates, particularly, as you say, amongst midlife Americans, particularly poorer white midlife Americans, you began to uncover what you called the phenomenon of deaths of despair. And I want to know exactly what you mean by that phrase.
Well, it's really just a convenient term, but just to go back to when we were first looking at these data, if we discovered that this mortality, which had been declining for 100 years, has suddenly stopped declining, the first thing we said, well, what in goodness name is it? And, the reason we found it is because we were working on suicide. And so we knew that suicide rates were rising quite rapidly in midlife. And so we went to see what are the other things that are rising very rapidly. And the other things we found were drug overdoses and alcoholic liver disease. And these all have a sort of element of suicide about them. I mean, I really don't want to say that drug addicts want to die. They often don't. But it's sort of drug addiction, abuse of alcohol, suicide are all sort of things that you're doing by your own hands. So that was why it was actually Anne who came up in a press interview with the notion of deaths of despair as just a label to put the three things together, and it really has caught off into the public discourse. It's become one of these terms that has a life of its own.
But and let me stop you just for a sec. Does that necessarily interest you as an economist? What if that is simply a phenomenon that is the result of the overprescription of a new kind of drug, at least new to many Americans, that is the whole range of opioid drugs? Wouldn't that make it just a temporary blip rather than a structural phenomenon that you as an economist would be interested in?
Well, you have to ask the question as to why did this overprescription of opioids only happen here? And why isn't it happening in Britain to anything like the same extent? And why is it happening in Germany or France at all? So there's a real question of what is it about American society, about the American economy that really causes this to happen? The other thing that's very important is when you said poorer white Americans, it's not really poorer white Americans, it's white Americans without a bachelor's degree, without this 4-year degree. So we were immediately in this thing where here's this economy. It's just not treating these people who haven't got a 4-year college degree very well. Not only that, but it's unloosed these pharmaceutical companies on them to make a huge amount of money and to propagate an enormous amount of misery and destruction among those people.
What kind of scale of extra death, if I can put it that way, are you ascribing to this phenomenon?
Well, the last years in which we have data are 2017 and 2018, and there were 158,000 deaths of despair in each of those 2 years for which we have data. That's more people than have died of COVID-19 in the US so far. COVID-19 may well exceed that. These are very, very large numbers. They're not all excess because, after all, there's always some suicides. There are going to be people who die from alcohol poisoning and so on. And we reckon that normally runs at about 60,000 a year. So it's killing about 100,000 people a year. And one of the analogies we use in the book is if you take a Boeing 737 fully loaded and it falls out of the sky, killing everybody on board, 3 of those every day is about what we're talking about here. These are big numbers.
They are very big numbers, but as you've just indicated, we're getting used to potentially even bigger numbers with the scale of the COVID crisis, not least in the United States.
That's right, except that COVID is going to stop, we hope. Either the virus will go away, as Donald Trump likes to say, or we'll get a vaccine or we'll get a medicine to deal with it. So, let's say in this year we lose 200,000 Americans. We can pray and reasonably hope that that will not go on into the future. But the 158,000 deaths of despair shows no signs of diminishing at all.
So is there any relationship at all between the way COVID-19 is impacting America and the particular groups within America it's hitting hardest, and the groups you've identified as being most vulnerable, most impacted by these so-called deaths of despair?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, and we spent a lot of time thinking about that. So one of the things that's clearly happened with COVID is there's been this division between people like me or like you who can sit at home and work or work behind the screen, and you continue to get paid and you run very little risk of catching the disease. They typically tend to be more educated people, people with desk jobs, and so on. Whereas the people on the other end, the essential workers or the key workers, in many cases have to risk their lives, and they are more likely to be less educated people. It's not a perfect match because obviously there are doctors and healthcare workers who are pretty highly skilled. But the people who are working in retail stores, people who are working in meatpacking plants and food retail, all that sort of stuff, those people are relatively poorly skilled. So the less than college educated people who were hurt by deaths of despair are hurt again by COVID-19. The one group that's different are African Americans here. And until about 2013, African Americans were not subject to any of this, the deaths of despair. Though after 2013, there was a sort of epidemic of fentanyl in the inner cities in the eastern United States, which turned black mortality up. But African Americans have really been suffering disproportionately during COVID-19 in America, as indeed has been the case in Britain.
Yeah, I want to get to the African American experience in greater detail later, but I just want to be clear here what you're actually saying, because as I said at the very beginning, you're one of the world's renowned economists. That's what you do. You are not a health specialist, and yet you seem to be making a very direct correlation here between the national health, that is, the health of the American people, and economic conditions. And in essence, a lot of it seems to be about people in low-paid jobs, in poverty, with lower education.
No, it's not. That's not right. It's right until you said the word poverty. We have no evidence that these people are in poverty. And in fact, poverty
so this is not about poverty.
Predominantly African American, and those people were doing pretty well until recently. So this is not a poverty thing. That's not part of the story. It's less educated thing. And we're not tying it in any very simple way to economic conditions. Because if you look at what happened after the Great Recession in 2008, deaths of despair were rising rapidly before the Great Recession. They rose at the same rate during the Great Recession, and they rose at the same rate after the Great Recession. Nothing to do with the Great Recession. So the story we're telling is a much slower disintegration of the life of working class America, a life that was built at the end of the 19th century, thrived in the 20th century, and has been coming apart ever since. And we tell a sort of Durkheimian story. You might say, what are economists messing with Durkheim for? But Durkheim really got this right, which is if you're living in a world where meaning is evaporating, then self-destruction is a real risk.
My reading of the book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, is that if there's any one target of your anger right now, it is the American healthcare system. And when you talk about the disintegration of the lives and culture of working class white Americans, it would seem to me you put a lot of the blame for that at the door of America's private healthcare system. Am I right?
Yes, you are dead right.
So what's to be done about it?
Well, there's lots of things we can do about it. It's just very difficult to do them because it's so well protected and fortified against criticism and against change. But the nuts of the story is that it costs far too much. It costs twice as much as any other health system in the world. It delivers lousy outcomes. And it's financed by what is essentially a poll tax on workers. And so, as we've said somewhere else, it has taken a wrecking ball to the labor market for less educated people.
Is that another way of you, as an economist, blaming capitalism? Because, of course, capitalism underpins the American healthcare system. It is a private system, it is for profit, and there are very big profits to be made. Are you saying capitalism simply doesn't work in that context?
In that context, which is in the case of delivering healthcare. I mean, Britain's a capitalist country. You don't have a private healthcare system, or you do, but only as a marginal thing on top of the National Health Service. No other country in the world, no other rich country in the world tries to run its healthcare as a private market system. And it's a very important thing to realize that one of the greatest economists of the 20th century was Ken Arrow. And Ken Arrow was the guy that proved the theorems, the Adam Smith theorems about how capitalism works and how capitalism is good for you and when it's not good for you. And the really important thing about proving those theorems was you need to figure out what are the assumptions to make it work. And the assumptions to make it work do not apply from healthcare. And we do not have a competitive healthcare system. It's riddled with all sorts of rent-seeking, with government interference. The government interference is not there to protect patients. The government interference is there to protect profit.
And yet, if I may say so, Sir Angus, when Americans are consulted about whether they want a truly, let's call it socialized, as many of its opponents do, socialized healthcare system where the government, in essence, organizes and runs the system and the profit motive is taken out of it, Americans by and large say no. That's not what they want.
Well, there's two things there. One is the word socialized has become demonized in America. And secondly, you don't have to have a socialized system. And Britain has a socialized system, but France doesn't, Germany doesn't, Switzerland doesn't, Holland doesn't, Canada doesn't. There's lots of options for it to choose from without the government delivering healthcare. And, that's a perfectly solvable problem. We do not have to have a system in which the government employs the doctors and nurses and runs the hospitals. Britain's pretty unique in doing that.
Let me come at this from a slightly different angle. You for a long time, in your writing about inequality and healthcare outcomes and all sorts of other things, you've made it plain that you're an opponent of the way America currently does things. But there's a whole raft of other thinkers in America, political scientists and economists, who say that you're barking up the wrong tree, that ultimately this isn't so much about economic systems, it's about moral values. And that the modern day, 21st century America is, unfortunately, as they would put it, full of people who lack the moral fiber to make the right kinds of decisions, and that is the fundamental failing of today's America.
I don't think that's true. There certainly are deep sociological and moral issues that are really important, like especially ones associated with family formation, especially the consequences of the availability of abortion and of the contraceptive pill, where there really have been changes in social views of childbearing and out of marriage and living together without a marriage.
That makes sense to me, because aren't many of
the labor force because they become lazy is just totally violated by the data.
Right, but I'm just looking at a quote from Philip Cohen here, who's done lots of research on this. He says that what you refer to as the phenomenon of deaths of despair is directly linked to the fact that marriage, and particularly he's talking about amongst white people, marriage isn't the institution it used to be. And that women in particular have changed their behaviors and their attitudes in ways that many women would welcome and say are very important, but they have fundamentally changed the way society works and the way the economy works.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, and we say that in the book. But, I don't like this idea that somehow they got up one morning and decided we're not going to behave ourselves anymore. And there were actually external things that made that very important. So the availability of contraceptive pills and the availability of abortion sort of changed the responsibility for childbearing, for conception, from men who had it before towards women. And for some women that worked really well. It drove a wedge so that for women who were really well educated or could be well educated, it opened up an enormous avenue of opportunity that they could really now go to college, they could choose when to have their childbearing, they didn't have to choose between education and having a married life. But for less educated, less talented women, that's sort of been a disaster. So,
but isn't that the problem in a way that I don't want to sort of put words into your mouth, but I would guess you characterize yourself as a liberal and a progressive. But it seems to me, in a way, the message that you are delivering, that the white communities of America are experiencing forms of despair because of the decline of family, community, and religion. That is a message that could be taken by some of your perhaps ideological opponents as a defense of their conservative values.
Well, you're characterizing me, I'm not characterizing me, and I don't accept that characterization. One of the things that I've tried very hard to do is to not label myself and to take the best from all particular things and all particular lines of thought. And, I don't think it's all that change in taste or the loss of industry or the loss of virtue. And you have to keep in mind, and this is very, very important, that these bad things are only happening to people who do not have a 4-year college degree. And the third of whites who have a 4-year college degree are doing great, thank you very much. And so if it's a general decline in virtue, why does the decline in virtue only happen to the people who are less educated? And it's because their world has collapsed around them and they've lost meaning. And, I don't care where you attribute it. And a lot of what we blame in the capitalist system is the degree of rent-seeking in America. And that's very much a right-wing buzzword, and I'm all for it.
I want to just come back quickly to the issue of what is happening to black Americans. You've pointed out that they are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We, of course, live in this particular time where there's much focus on the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and yet, of course, your work is very much focused on what has happened to the white